Well, let's move on. We're going to talk about our trending topic today, which is the psychology of emotional support animals. So sometimes they're called emotional comfort animals, emotional support animals, and we hear news stories all the time about this, particularly people who want to take a peacock on a plane or...
Peacock on a plane.
Why not?
Or
Why not?
In this past month, someone actually did take a horse on a plane.
Sweet.
Yeah. And actually the crew posed with the horse, which was...
That's good.
So they had the horse on the plane. So we're going to talk about emotional support animals. And let me just... can I start with a story?
Please.
Oh, I know which story you're about to
Have I
tell.
told it on the podcast before? I don't think I have.
I don't think
Okay.
so.
I don't know it.
Or it's been a while.
So I have
if you
permission to tell this story, but one day my daughter, my oldest daughter, had to do two presentations. One was for her senior exit in high school, and the other was for an anti-bullying initiative that the school system was adopting in her public school system. And she had to speak before the Board of County Commissioners at the Government Center. And so unbeknownst to my wife and I, my daughter took one of her ball pythons out of its enclosure, its habitat, put it in a pillowcase, and then stuffed the pillowcase down to the bottom of her messenger bag. And while she's doing her first presentation, talking about her senior exit project, she had her hand in the messenger bag and she was petting this python, this snake. No one knew that she'd smuggled the snake onto a public school campus and that she had it in the bag. Then she gets on a public bus, rides across town, and then she's at the Government Center, which in Charlotte, where we lived at the time, there's security guards, there's metal detectors, it's the whole deal. And the messenger bag gets across the counter, the guard opens it up, and there's a white pillowcase, and on the white pillowcase, there's a little note, and on the note it says, "Emotional comfort animal, please do not disturb me. My owner needs me for times of stress. I am not dangerous. I will not bite. Please, respect me," or something like that. And the guy says, "Oh, I know what you're talking about." And probably thinking it's like a hamster or something, not realizing it's a python, puts it through security. And then she's on local television with the messenger bag on her front with her hand in the bag, petting the python while she's presenting to the Board of County Commissioners.
petting the python to soothe her.
It sounds better than petting the
fears.
snake,
That is
to be honest.
my all-time favorite story of hers, but also of just like emotional support animals in general. So
That's Dave's petting the python story.
She's the only one on earth that could pull
I
that
know.
off.
And I said afterwards, I said, "Well, sweetie, what would happen if the guard said, I know that you want this for dealing with stress and all that, but you really can't bring a python into the Government Center?" She said, "Oh, they would have let me." And I said, "No, let's just say they didn't." And she goes, "No, they would have." Like there was no plan B and there was no consideration.
She's right,
that there's
but-
no plan B. So
But she's right.
and she was right.
She sounds like Frank whenever you say, "Well, Frank, what if this would happen?" It's not going to happen.
Right.
No.
Right.
No.
That's right.
No.
Well, I kept thinking about how, earlier you were talking about the horse. And did you know that the Americans with Disability Acts, as part of how they define service animals, they include mini horses?
Apparently so.
Like they say dogs, or miniature horses.
Well, there is one thing to consider. An emotional support animal is not considered a service animal.
That's true.
And most laws can bar an emotional support animal from restaurants and public spaces and stuff like that. It's two different
Well, and
categories.
just bear in mind too that in the story I just told, it wasn't even like she didn't have a doctor's note. She did this was her self-appointed emotional support animal also.
She had a Post-it probably on a pillowcase.
It was that.
Yeah.
It was a 3x5 card on a pillowcase. So
Yeah.
that was her documentation for it. So this is something that we've seen I love the story. We're not necessarily making fun of the idea of emotional support animals, but we're wondering about, like, or have we reached this point where it's too much, or is it something that's got a negative downside to it, the psychology of it? Emma Kate, what's your thought about the fact that we're seeing many more requests for emotional support animals on planes, in the workplace, in schools? Give me your thoughts about that.
I guess, and I think this is related to what you're asking, but it's almost as though I think there's nothing wrong with this. However, I do worry about the misuse of these sorts of animals, because the whole purpose of the service animal being created in the first place, and I know we're just, differentiating between service versus therapy, but it's like people don't necessarily know the difference. Obviously, there's a little label that says this is a service dog. Oftentimes you can't touch them, but people still want to touch the animal. And I guess I just worry about how the misuse of these sorts of services, regardless, are harmful to people who really need them, as opposed to just being like, oh, I want to, bring my dog with me on this plane, or my snake on a plane.
Right.
I mean, when you go to Europe, or as much I can remember France, dogs are everywhere. Dog's is gonna be sitting in a chair right next to me, and I'm
smoking a cigarette, wearing a beret.
Yeah, I'm like, I have some more steak. But I mean, I don't really see much of a downside to it, and I think as long as it's not a snake, or not a peacock, or a cow, or that's just ridiculous. But
a cow would never fit in a pillowcase, Frank. Don't be stupid.
Well, it could be a miniature cow. I don't know if those things exist. Yeah. But I mean, I don't have much of an opinion negatively about it, and I have seen in my practice an increase, uptick in seeing people with their emotional support animals, and some of them are actually service animals, especially for some of my autistic kids. But it's been a real upside for most of my clients. I think it's a fantastic thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that if I see someone here at the practice and they have a service dog or emotional support pet or animal, I think that's great. But I also think it's in the larger context that they're seeking out traditional talk therapy, right, and they are processing their struggles, and they're developing some practical tools. And so an emotional support animal is one tool in their tool belt of combating and managing their mental health. I think something like one of the biggest things that's hitting our culture right now is like adult coloring books for anxiety. And I think that's great if it's one of several tools, but if it's something that we've seen in the past with people with medication, they want a pill to be a quick fix, and they don't develop all of these other types of strategies, then it's really a short-term relief that's not really addressing some of the fundamental struggles. Because if somebody gets an emotional support pet, and that is the only thing that they have in their arsenal to address their mental health challenges, life's going to be harder. It's just going to get harder for two reasons. One is they're not developing tools, and number two is that pet's going to not outlive them. And what are you going to do there? So I think it's great how we are being more open and creative about resources and tools. I just don't want people to lean into that at the expense of developing cognitive behavioral tools, reframing, mindfulness, all those other things that are tried and true.
Right.
Well, I thought we would have more controversy about it on the panel, but it sounds like the consensus is that this is an okay thing, with what you're saying being noted, right? Is that people are okay.
Yeah, and part of that's I want one. Like I want to be able to take a pet anywhere.
Pets are the best.
And be like, well, this is I'm a therapist, so this is for other people that I meet to help them.
Well, there's a very specific part of the brain that is associated with animals. And as humans, I think over domestication and being around animals, it's sort of a close relationship for as long as humans have been around. But there's this thing called visual agnosia.
Oh, yeah, visual agnosia.
Or actually, I'm sorry, let me replace that. It's facial agnosia.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yes. And basically, you can get a very specific kind of brain damage where you lose the ability to recognize another person's face. And it's talked about in the book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat.
Prosopagnosia, is that the one?
Facial agnosia.
Okay.
And so in the story, the man got up from the psychiatrist and reached over and tried to take his wife's head and pick it up because he thought it was his hat. And so you lose the ability to recognize anything. But when you have facial agnosia for humans, you do not lose the ability to recognize the face of animals, which is where neurologists or researchers said, okay, these are very different parts of the brain.
Well, just to clarify, because I am obsessed with that book for the record, and if people have not read Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, please do. It's fascinating.
It is fantastic.
If you're interested in that. But so what Frank is referring to is these individuals can no longer look at like a scene of a desert and say, this is a desert. They would say, oh, here's a cactus, here's a rock, here's sand, but they couldn't say what it is. So they can still get details because that gentleman that you're referring to could see like, okay, here's a mole, and then realize that's so-and-so.
He could recognize parts of her.
But I think, what was your point with this with animals?
That we are uniquely associated, that there's a part of our brain that is uniquely associated with animals. And that there's a special relationship between people and animals. It's soothing. And we have sort of evolved together in this domestic way, especially with dogs.
Are spiders soothing, Frank?
Nope. There's a part of the brain
Is that an animal?
that is specifically designed to recognize snakes and spiders. It's a very different part of the brain because
Not for my daughter.
if I know. But as humans evolved, the people who are like, la, 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 oh, what's the little thing there that's squiggling on the ground, and they get bit by the snake, they get killed. So the more likely you are to be able to spot that snake and that part of your brain gets triggered, the more likely you are to be alive.
It's interesting that I think the rise in emotional security animals or support animals is directly correlated to the rise of anxiety and the decrease of resiliency. Mm-hmm. We're looking for external things to really kind of soothe more internal or environmental stressors. And to me, there's something soothing about an animal, but it's also almost elementary. Like it takes us back to a more kind of like younger, childlike. And I feel like we're seeing that even in terms of how people deal with intense emotions. Like they're not showing a lot of nuance and maturity. I just see a lot of adults when emotions get intense, they resort to primitive, childlike responses. So to me, it would make sense that in that elevated state, they would look for something that reminds them of the safety and security of being a child, which to me would be a stuffed animal or a pet.
So I have to comment because somebody just walked into our recording space with a dog and I have ADHD, and then I wanted to bring it in, but I realized I couldn't do that.
That would be
Thanks for that.
Yeah, that'd be
it's just
animal.
a fun fact for the moment. But they make, actually, I'm going to relate it and make it meaningful. So that dog brought me into the present moment. And that is one really important way that we can handle strong emotions. Reel it in and say, okay, how do I tune into right now?
And Kate, there's a squirrel right there. Look.
I love squirrels,
squirrel.
but not as much as dogs. But I'm serious, though. This is a really valid point, in my opinion, where if we are using, and this is piggybacking on your comment, where if we're using animals to bring us in, they literally do force you to say, oh, look at their soft fur, look at how they're laughing. Or,
That's how I look at
or
Hedderly.
Smiling,
soft fur.
His
like
soft
when I
fur,
walk-
I like how he laughs.
When I would walk my dog, I found myself wondering, I'm like, what do they smell? Like, what is that? And it just takes you out of your own mental space to say, let's be here. But at the same point, we can't ignore these things that you all are talking about. It has to be in conjunction with other
So,
stuff.
Hedderly, today when you were petting my hair and scratching my head, did you feel more in the moment as you were petting me?
Well, see, I was doing that for your benefit, not mine.
Did you get a benefit, like a secondary benefit?
It sounds
I
very
got a
personal.
film on my fingers that
It's very
must have
personal.
been your hair product, but
Film on fingers, petting.
Well,
Okay.
back on task. I love pets, especially dogs, and I do love the fact that dogs can be a great therapeutic support for people. There is part of me though with what Jonathan's saying that that I just want to go back to is that it does sometimes feel like, because of this movement toward emotional support animals, that it's in some ways almost a regression of, like, I'm going back to something younger and not really developing skills that I have internal to me, that I can carry around no matter where I'm going to use to soothe myself. That feels, I mean, I'm not opposed to emotional support animals at all, but it does feel like having this sort of blanket or stuffed animal or dog in the workplace or on the plane isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's maybe not as good as having the cognitive, the mental skills as the primary way of coping with intense anxiety. As much as I love dogs, as much as I like having them around, there's part of me that just wonders if the emphasis is too much on this external thing and not enough on the coping skills.
Right.
I agree with that, because I think one of the things I find in my practice, and I'm curious if this is true for you all too, is that there's a misperception behind coping skills where everyone assumes it's meant to completely remove your discomfort, when the reality is these skills are meant to actually help you approach what you're afraid of as opposed to avoid. And I think that's what you're getting at.
Right.
And I think a lot of times, I mean, we're in this era where we're destigmatizing and normalizing mental health, depression, and anxiety. And a lot of times when we shift from one stigma or one, point on a pendulum, we go to an extreme. And then over time, we sort of find that nuanced balance. I think when I think about emotional support animals, I think of it similar to school refusal and people that have such anxiety towards school that for some people, generally through labor and hardship, that they just cannot overcome that and they're not going to be functional in a school setting. But for a lot of people, they may step out of school for a while, develop some tools, resources, and progressively re-enter the normal school environment. And that's a success story versus anybody that has social anxiety or stress about math, or that they automatically can't go to school and you accommodate that. Like the emotional support animals, I think, can be a starting point or part of a tool belt. But if that's all that happens, you're accommodating the anxiety, you're accommodating the fear, and it's not going to get better. In fact, it's probably going to get worse.
Right. And that's a good point. Is like anytime you don't directly address the anxiety and the fear, it tends to either stay the same or gain more ground on you rather than improve. So if, there's some really good things about emotional support animals, and of course we all love doggies and pets and such, but what we're kind of ultimately landing on, it sounds like, is the need to develop those internal skills of coping, being willing to expose yourself to things that are not that are distressing or that are anxiety provoking, with a way of thinking it through cognitively, so that you're getting better, you're strengthening yourself. It's more of taking a long-term view of it.
So you're saying I should expose myself to Hedderly?
Go for it.
Okay.
There it
And
is.
with that, that's going to...
Wait. I have a question. What would be kind of the weirdest emotional support animal you would like to have that is not a dog or a cat?
Otter.
You want an emotional support otter?
I don't know why. It's just the first
I
thing
like
that came
that.
in my head.
Okay. Dave,
You're
how about
so
you?
cuddly.
moose.
An emotional support moose. Those things are aggressive. Okay. Ederly, what about you?
Either a hedgehog or an armadillo.
Armadillo, they give you leprosy. Okay.
You could get a hedgehog.
I want an emotional support kangaroo.
Oh, yeah.
I think that would be fun.
Till it punches you with its leg.
There you go. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. If you want to support our show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts and also subscribe. And if you like the episode, you can find out more content exploring the intersection of psychology and pop culture by visiting shrinktank.com. You can also watch the video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. We hope you're doing that. And don't forget to check out the show notes of this episode for details on today's trending topic. We welcome your feedback. For suggestions or comments on our show. Tweet us at shrink_tank, message us on Facebook, or shoot us an email at feedback@shrinktank.com. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hederly, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.
Shrink Tank.